Welcome to New Possibilities. I speak truth to power without fear. So earlier today, I was listening to Democracy Now! And they were talking about this study involving black boys. So I went online to find articles about this study, and I saw this article from the New York Times entitled Extensive Data Shows Punishing Reach of Racism for Black Boys. Now, what I'm going to do is read some excerpts from this article, and as I do so, I'm going to provide my commentary. So, this article says black boys raised in America, even in the wealthiest families and living in some of the most well to do neighborhoods, still earn less in adulthood than white boys with similar backgrounds, according to a new study that traced the lives of millions of children. White boys who grew up rich are likely to remain that way. Black boys raised at the top, however, are more likely to become poor than to stay wealthy in their own adult households. Now, this raises a lot of questions. I'm going to go into this chart right here, and then I'm going to provide further commentary. But it says that white boys who grew up rich, 39% of them end up rich as adults, compared to only 17% for black men. And then of white boys who grow up rich, 10% of them end up poor compared to 21% for black boys. Now, the question that I have is, how is this possible? How does this happen? Now, this article doesn't really tell us what happens in these young men's lives to make a difference, to cause such a disproportionate number of rich black boys to end up being poor black men. It doesn't go into much detail, but I would be interested in knowing what happened in their lives down the way that led to them being poor, even though they grew up in rich households. And why is it that only 17% of black boys who grow up rich end up rich as adults? What happens along the way that results in such a small number of them maintaining and continuing that legacy of wealth? I refuse to believe that it has something to do with black people not being skillful or having the same level of intelligence or resourcefulness. I refuse to believe that. I think that the larger society has some kind of role to play in this, but this article really doesn't issue, much of the information about why that is, why this disparity exists. There are general statements about racism in society, but I would want to know the details, like how is this possible? How does this happen? And the fact that you have these disparities, tells you a lot about how race, in many ways, trumps class in this society. And one thing that really comes up in here that's really disturbing is the difference between black boys and black girls. This study says that though black girls and women face deep inequality on many measures, black and white girls from families with comparable earnings attain similar individual incomes as adults. So here you have a situation where black women are on par with white women when it comes to individual incomes as adults. But when it comes to black men and white men, there's a disparity. And I want to know, why does that exist? I don't think that that's a coincidence. I think it's by design. So this study goes on to say this. It says black men consistently earn less than white men, regardless of whether they were raised poor or rich. And it goes on to say no such income gap exists between black and white women raised in similar households. And I don't think this is a mistake, as I said before. And the reason why I say that is because whenever you want to destroy a people, the first thing you do is destroy the man. You marginalize the man, you weaken the man, you destroy the man, and you raise up the women. You take the women and the children under your wing. And in many ways, One could say that despite some of the discrimination that black women face, in many ways they are elevated above the black men. We can see this in terms of income disparities between black men and women. We can see this in terms of job opportunities, in terms of educational levels, in terms of entrepreneurship, and all those things. We can see that there are differences between the position of the black woman in this society compared to the position of the black man in this society. And I think that that difference has helped undermine the family structure in the black community. And it kind of reminds me of a video that I posted a few years ago about divide and conquer strategies that were used in Africa during colonialism, how they would divide this tribe against that tribe and have them warring with each other. I think that this whole disparity between black men and black women is another example of divide and conquer. Giving black women certain privileges that black men are not entitled to, thereby creating more division in the black community. And we see that division very well here on YouTube, how you have black men and black women at each other's throats, involved in this endless, counterproductive gender war. So let's continue on in this article. This article goes on to say that the study, based on anonymous earnings and demographic data for virtually all Americans now in their late 30s, debunks a number of widely held hypotheses about income inequality. Gaps persist even when black and white boys grew up in families with the same income, similar family structures, similar education levels, and even similar levels of accumulated wealth. So often we're told about if you do the right thing, you get the education, you get the good job and all that kind of stuff, then you'll be okay in American society. We're taught this myth of respectability politics, but despite someone playing by all the rules, there are still massive gaps that exist between the black community and the white community, between black people who even have a certain type of status and white people. And again, that's just a reminder of how, in many ways, race trumps class in this society. And unfortunately, as this article points out, a lot of liberals think that if they just address class, then that will automatically cure problems of race. They look to these broad-based solutions to different problems without race-specific type of solutions. And that's the reason why, a lot of these problems in terms of the disparity between blacks and whites continue to exist because we don't want to address the issue of race. We don't want to deal with the structural racism, the institutionalized racism in this society. Instead, we would rather deal with class because that's more acceptable to discuss in this society. So I'm going to go through and read some more segments of this article. Now, this article also deals with poverty. It talks about those who grew up in poor households and where they end up. And it basically talks about how the situation is reversed. We saw when it came to blacks who were wealthy, black boys who grew up in wealthy households, they were more likely to end up poor than to remain rich. And here we see the opposite. So for poor people, poor black people, black boys in particular, they are more likely to continue to be poor than they are to become rich or middle class or upper middle class. So according to this study, like black boys who grow up poor, 48% of them end up poor as adults. For white people, white boys, that percent is 31%. So 31% of white boys who grew up poor end up poor as adults. And then when you look at those who end up rich, for black boys, only 2% of them who grew up poor end up rich, compared to 10% for white boys. And this article points out how for poor children, the pattern is reversed again. Most poor black boys will remain poor as adults. White boys raised in poor families fare far better. So again, this is another reminder that class is less significant than race. Because here you have black boys and white boys growing up poor, but the white boy is more likely to end up rich, more likely to end up in the upper middle class, more likely to end up in the middle class or even the lower middle class. Whereas the black boy who grows up poor is more likely to remain poor. Now, this also goes back into this issue of the disparities between black men and black women. It talks about how black women also face negative effects of racism. Black men often experience racial discrimination differently. As early as preschool, they are more likely to be disciplined in school. They are pulled over and detained and searched by the police officers more often. And we see examples of this every day. When we see these incidents of police brutality where unarmed men are killed by the police, we see that the men are the ones who are primarily targeted by these police. Men are the ones being beaten and shot and killed by these police. Yes, women are victims of police brutality, but the primary target is black men. And I've cited this over and over again, but according to a 2015 study done by the Washington Post, even though black men make up 6% of the U.S. population, they make up 40% of the unarmed people shot and killed by the police. Again, that's not a mistake. It's not an accident. Again, when you want to conquer a people, you eliminate the men. You kill off the men and leave behind the women and the children. And that's what we see. We see that with the police brutality. We see it with the inner city violence. We see it with the mass incarceration of black men. It's a very real issue. And we see it with this massive disparity in wealth and income. Even for black men that come from wealthy households, they end up making far less than their white counterpart. There is something wrong with that. There's something fundamentally wrong with this society that allows that kind of thing to happen. Again, I refuse to embrace this idea that somehow there's something wrong with the black man. There's something wrong with this society. That's where the problem lies. And this article also cites some disturbing statistics about incarceration. It says that the new data shows that 21% of black men raised at the very bottom were incarcerated, according to a snapshot of a single day during the 2010 census. Black men raised in the top 1% by millionaires were as likely to be incarcerated as white men raised in households earning less than $36,000. That is just mind blowing. The fact that a black man with all these opportunities, raised by millionaires, is just as likely as a white man raised in a household only earning $36,000 to be incarcerated. Something about that doesn't add up. Something about that doesn't make any kind of sense at all. But we can see that when we look at a society where you have a disparity in sentencing in this society, where despite the fact that you could have a situation where the same crime is committed by two people, but because of the race of one, a black person, for instance, will receive a harsher sentence. We can see why we had this mass incarceration. We see the problem of, you know, black people being railroaded in the criminal justice system. There are many examples of black men who have been charged with rape, and years later, through DNA evidence, they're found to be not guilty. They're found to be exonerated. We see this all the time. So it is no surprise that you have this disparity in sentencing, even for those black men who come from wealthy households. This study also found that Disparities in income, broad disparities in income still exist between black and white men, even when they were raised in homes with the same incomes and the same family structure. Broad income disparities continue to exist. So that means that, despite all this talk about like single parent households being to blame for all the problems in the black community, even when you have a two-parent household and you're doing all the right things and you earn a certain income, at the end of the day, you end up earning less than your white male counterpart if you're a black man. There's something crazy about that. That means that there's something racist about this society. Where you have situations where a black man could have the same education, same level of experience, but yet the black man is earning less than his white counterpart. Again, this is just a reminder of how pervasive racism is in society, how it is systemic, and how it is insidious. It's like a virus that runs throughout the body of this country called America. And it goes on to say this: as the chart shows, a black man raised by two parents together in the 90th percentile, making around $140,000 a year, earned about the same in adulthood as a white man raised by a single mother making $60,000 alone. So again, like at the end of the day, the outcomes are still negative for black people. Like you have a black man that's raised in a two-parent household where they're making decent money, but as an adult, he still ends up earning the same as somebody raised in a less affluent home, in a single-parent household who is white. That just tells you like how unfair this society is, and it just shows you how much of a sham and how much a joke the American dream is for black people. This article goes on to say that poor white children struggle in parts of the Southeast and Appalachia, but they still fare better. They still fare better than poor black children do in most of America. They still fare better than poor black children do in most of America. So even poor whites are doing better than poor black children in America. So even among the poor, there's still a racial hierarchy in this society. It goes on to say this: in effect, the worst places for whites produce outcomes that are about as good as the best places for blacks. I mean, this article is a wake-up call. This article goes on to say that African Americans made up 35% of all children raised in the bottom 1% of the income distribution. They made up less than 1% of the children at the very top. Yeah, so tell me what y'all think about these statistics. What do you think about this situation? It's just horrible that even when you're wealthy, you grow up in a wealthy household, you still have to deal with the effects of racism in this society. So tell me what y'all think. Please rate, comment, and subscribe. Peace.